getting a description of the barge which conveyed the goods from Queen Height. The whole party of the creditors now set off in pursuit. About dawn the next morning, they overtake the barge, a little below Gravesend, when 4 men are observed leaving her and rowing to the shore in a skiff. Peter Snook is found sitting quietly in the cabin, although apparently a little surprised at seeing Mr. Pester. Betrays nothing like embarrassment or fear. Mr. Pester, is it you? Glad to see you, sir. So you've been taking a trip out of town and are going back with us? We shall get to Billingsgate between 8 and 9, they say. And I hope it won't be later, as a bill of yours comes due today, and I want to be home in time to write a check for it. The goods are also found on board, together with 3 men in the hold, gagged, and tied hand and foot. They give it a strange account of themselves, being in the employ of Mr. Heavyside, a lighterman. They were put in charge of the flitter when she was hired by Peter Snook for a trip to Gravesend. According to their orders, they took the barge in the first instance to a wharf near Queen Height and helped to load her with some goods brought down in carts. Mr. Snook afterward came on board, bringing with him 2 fierce-looking men and, quote-unquote, a little man with a hooked nose, Ephraim. Mr. S. and the little man then, quote-unquote, had a sort of jollification in the cabin, till the latter got drunk and was carried ashore. They then proceeded down the river, nothing particular occurring until they had passed Greenwich Hospital, when Mr. S. ordered them to lade the barge alongside a large black-sided ship. No sooner was the order obeyed than they were boarded by a number of men from said ship, who seized them, bound them, gagged them, and put them in the hold. The immediate consequence of this information is that Peter was bound, gagged, and put in the hold in the same manner, by way of retaliation and for safe keeping on his way back to the city. On the arrival of the party, a meeting of the creditors is called. Peter appears before them in great rage and with the air of an injured man. Indeed, his behavior is so malapropos to his situation as entirely to puzzle his interrogators. He accuses the whole party of a conspiracy. "Peter Snook," said Mr. Pester solemnly from the chair, "that look does not become you after what is past. Let me advise you to conduct yourself with propriety. You will find it the best policy, depend on it." "Pretty thing for you for come to talk of propriety," exclaimed Peter. "You, that seed me laid hold on by a set of ruffians, and never said a word, nor given information afterwards. And here have I been swept away from business I don't know how long, and shut up like a dog in a kennel. But I look upon you. You were at the bottom of it all. You and that fellow with the plum-pudding face has blowed me up about a cask of gin. What you both mean by it, I can't think, but if there's any law in the land, I'll make you remember it. Both of you. That's what I will." Mr. Snook swears that he never saw Job in his life. except on the occasion of his capture in the flitter, and positively denies having looking out any parcel of goods at the house of Job, Flash Bill and Company with the banker, Mr. Bluff. He acknowledges an acquaintance, but not having drawn for the 270 pounds odd, or having ever overdrawn for a shilling in his life. Moreover, he is clearly of opinion that the banker has still in his hands more than 150 pounds of his, Mr. Snook's, money. He can designate several gentlemen as being no creditors of his, although they were of the number of those from whom his purchase had been made for the whacking, shipping out. And although the goods were found in the flitter, Ephraim is summoned and testifies to all the particulars of his master's return, and the subsequent packing, cart loading, and embarkation, as already told, accounting for the extravagances of Mr. Snook as being, quote-unquote, all along of that Miss Bodkin. "Lord, master, he's glad to see you again," exclaimed Ephraim. "Who'd have thought as it'd come to this?" "Come to what?" cried Peter. "I'll make him repent of it, every man jack of 'em, before I've done, if there's any law to be had for love or money." "Ah, sir," said Ephraim, "we'd better have stuck to the retail. I was afraid that shipping consarn wouldn't answer, but and tell you so if you recollect, but you wouldn't hearken to me." "What shipping concern?" inquired Peter with a look of amazement. "La, master," exclaimed Ephraim, "it ain't of any use to pretend to keep it a secret now when everybody knows it. I didn't tell Mr. Pester, though, till the last, when all the goods was gone out of the shop, and the sheriff's officers had come to take possession of the house." "Sheriff's officers in possession of my house?" roared Peter. "All the goods gone out of the shop? What do you mean by that, you rascal? What have you been doing in my absence?" Then he sprang forward furiously and seized the trembling shopman by the collar with a degree of violence which rendered it difficult for the two officers in attendance to disengage him from his hold. Hereupon Mr. Snap, the attorney, retained by the creditors, harangues the company at some length, and intimates that Mr. Snook is either mad or acting the madman for the purpose of evading punishment. A practitioner from Bedlam is sent for, and some artifice is resorted to, but to no purpose. It is found impossible to decide upon the question of sanity. The medical gentleman, in his report to the creditors, confesses himself utterly perplexed, and without giving a decision, details the particulars of a singular story told him by Mr. Snook himself concerning the mode of his escape from drowning after he fell aboard from the Rosenjune. "It is a strange, unlikely tale, to be sure," says the physician, "and if his general conversation was that of the wild, imaginative, flighty kind which I have so often witnessed, I should say it was purely ideal, but he appears to be a plain-spoken, simple sort of person, that it is difficult to conceive how he could invent such a fiction." Mr. Snook's narrative is then told, not in his very words, but in the author's own way, with all the particulars obtained from Peter's various recitations. We give it only in brief. Upon tumbling overboard, Mr. Snook, at least according to his own story, swam courageously as long as he could. He was upon the point of sinking, however, when an oar was thrust under his arm, and he found himself lifted up in a boat by, quote-unquote, a dozen dark-looking men. He's taken on board a large ship, and the captain, who is a droll genius, and talks in rhyme somewhat after the fashion of the wondrous tale of Alroy, entertains him with great cordiality, dresses him in a suit of his own clothes, makes him drink in the first place a brimmer of, quote-unquote, something hot, and afterwards plies him with wines and cordials of all kinds, at a supper of most magnificent description, warmed in body and mind by this excellent cheer. Peter reveals his inmost secrets to the host, and talks freely and minutely of 1,000 things, of his man Ephraim, of his oddities, of his bank account, of his great credit, of his adventures with Miss Spotkin, of his prospects in trade, and especially of the names, residences, etc., of the wholesale houses with whom he is in the habit of dealing. Presently, being somewhat overcome with wine, he goes to bed at the suggestion of the captain, who promises to call him in season for a boat in the morning, which will convey him to Billingsgate in full time for Pester and Company's note. How long he slept is uncertain, but when he awoke, a great change was observable in the captain's manner, who was somewhat brusque, and handed him over the ship's side in a barge, where he was discovered by the creditors in pursuit, in which he was assured would convey him to Billingsgate. This relation is thus succinctly given by us, implies little or nothing. The result, however, to the reader is ingeniously led by the author, who is that real Peter Snook has been duped, and that Peter Snook, who made the various purchases about town, and who appeared to Ephraim only during the morning and evening twilight of the eventful day, and was in fact no other person than the captain of the quote-unquote strange black-sided ship. We are to believe that, taking advantage of Peter's communicativeness and a certain degree of personal resemblance to himself, he assumed our hero's clothes while he slept and made a bold and nearly successful attempt at a wholesale peculation. The incidents of this story are forcibly conceived, and even in the hands of an ordinary writer who would scarcely fail or of effect. But in the present instance, so unusual a tact is developed in the narration that we are inclined to rank quote-unquote Peter Snook as among the few tales which, each in his own way, are absolutely faultless. It is a Flemish home piece of the highest order. It merits lying in its chiaroscuro. In that blending of light and shade and shadow, where nothing is too distinct, yet where the idea is fully conveyed. In the absence of all rigid outlines and all miniature painting, in the not undue warmth of the coloring, and in a well-subdued exaggeration at all points, an exaggeration never amounting to caricature.